Welcome to Between the Lines video chat. Today, our guest is Norman Solomon, National Director of the progressive activist group rootsaction.org and Executive Director of the Institute for Public Accuracy. He's author of more than a dozen books, including War Made Invisible, How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine, and he's written about politics for many publications, including The Hill, The Nation, The Guardian, Common Dreams, The Los Angeles Times, and Salon. Norman's new book will be published the first week of December, and it's titled The Blue Road to Trump Hell: How Corporate Democrats Paved the Way for Autocracy. Norman's a longtime friend of WPKN Radio and Between the Lines Radio News Magazine, as well as the progressive community media nationwide. Norman, congratulations on your important and timely new book that features the cartoons of Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist Matt Worker. And we really want to thank you for joining myself and Between the Lines producers Melinda Tuhus and Richard Hill to talk about the new book.
Hey, well, glad to be here. Thanks, Scott, and congratulations to Between the Lines, a national asset for progressives.
That's right. We're celebrating our 35th anniversary, actually, next year. Scary. Norman, just to recap of what we've been going through, I don't know why I always like to frame this, but I do. So we're more than 10 months into Trump's second term, and there's no debate that this twice impeached convicted felon president is aggressively pursuing a hardline authoritarian agenda that was laid out in detail in the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. Trump and the Republican Party have blatantly defied the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and rule of law by dismantling large parts of the federal government, such as the Department of Education, USAID, FEMA, as they've defunded cancer, Alzheimer's, and other vaccine research. He's deployed a massed ICE secret police force to abduct non-citizens and citizens alike, denying many their due process rights. And he's prosecuting and indicting his perceived political enemies. Trump's abused his presidential power to repress free speech by using the Federal Communications Commission to threaten media companies, to cancel Stephen Colbert's show, Jimmy Kimmel, we all know about. Seth Meyers is on the target list, and a long list of other TV programs targeted because they criticized Trump. Trump and the Republican Congress have defunded all U.S. public broadcasting. That includes TV and radio, PBS and NPR. And Trump has censored the U.S. history of slavery and the Jim Crow era at the Smithsonian Institution, censored books across the federal government, and fired hundreds of federal workers associated with diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. All this as he's deployed National Guard troops first to Los Angeles, then Washington, D.C., and plans to do the same if he can get through the courts in Portland, as well as Memphis, which is already happening, and Chicago. On top of all that, Trump has issued executive orders labeling his critics, progressive activists, and political opponents domestic and foreign terrorists. And most recently, he's called for the execution of Democratic lawmakers who advised active duty U.S. military men and women not to obey illegal, unconstitutional orders. This, of course, just scratches the surface of what we've seen unfold in the Trump regime in less than a year. Norman, your book makes the case that the Democratic Party and its leaders, through many errors and missteps, set the stage for Trump and his election victories in 2016 and 2024. Review for our listeners the evidence for this charge that you very well document in your new book, and why you think it's important to examine these issues today in order to prevent another authoritarian or fascist leader coming to power here in the U.S. in the future.
Well, of course, there are many factors that lead to election results. What is right in front of us and what we have to, I think, really deal with is the fact that the Democratic Party literally enabled Trump to be elected president twice. And while we know that the Republican Party has moved farther and farther to the right, it's less obvious that you can't fight bogus, phony pseudo populism with mushy centrism that is in itself very pro corporate and doesn't convincingly tell people that the opposition to Trump, the Democratic Party, people on the ballot with a D after their names, if you can't convince people that the party is going to fight for their interests, going to fight corporate power, to fight for the rights of workers, for children, for the retired, for the elderly, if there's not a case that can convincingly be made by the Democratic Party, then the phony populists will, as we saw in 2016 and then in 2024, the phony populists will win. And Scott, as you sketched out, I think both very thoroughly and inevitably just scratching the surface of the horrors of this administration, this regime under Trump, it has gotten terribly worse month by month, almost week by week. And so we're faced, I think, with the challenge that it's necessary for whether we call ourselves progressives, liberals, or libertarians, even, or whatever, that we simultaneously are part of a united front to challenge this regime and also challenge some within the united front who are militarists, who are corporatists, who don't really fight for the working class, for working people, for wannabe working people, and vulnerable in our society. So to more directly answer your question here, the Democratic Party has been captive of its funders, especially at the national level. And so if the gazillionaires, the wealthy, the corporate elites have such power over the Democratic Party, then it has really limited the capacity, the willingness of Democratic Party leaders to actually fight for, so to speak, average people. And so often voters have faced the choice, as it is, between the right wing and the Democratic Party, which doesn't seem to really fight for them.
Thanks, Norman. Melinda, do you have a question for Norman about the book?
Well, yeah, it very interesting. It brought up all the horrible history of the Democratic, mainstreamers and the media toward Bernie Sanders, which, you know, both times he ran, which was pretty upsetting, and probably made the difference in who ended up getting nominated. But I just had a question. Well, it's like who's in and who's out in terms of this broad united front. And one question was, I have two questions that are kind of related. I've read that the Progressive Caucus is the biggest caucus in the House, and it's like I don't know. I think you said 2/5 or somewhere 2/5 of all the members, or maybe more. Um, but it seems like some of the people in the Progressive Caucus aren't so progressive. And I just wondered how people get in. Do they just self-select? And are there any principles they're supposed to adhere to be members of the Progressive Caucus and stand for something?
Yeah, well, almost half of the Democrats in the House, as you say, are members of the Progressive Caucus. There's been some push-pull and efforts to have a more defined definition or requirement to be a member. There's not much. There are certain limitations of you can't be crossing too many progressive or liberal lines and still stay in the caucus. But basically, it's a club that almost anybody who's a Democrat in the House, anybody in the House who wants to be part of it, can be. And you're reminding me of really the pivotal moment, one of those that I write about in this book, that there was a chance to get this transformational Build Back Better legislation through early on in the Biden presidency. And the Republicans really wanted an infrastructure bill. And so they didn't want Build Back Better because they thought it was, or claimed it was socialist and so forth. And they thought that was a bad thing. It was reminiscent of the New Deal and so forth. So the strategy, the way to get it through in the thinly divided House and Senate between the two parties was for progressives to say, as they did, that we're only going to pass the infrastructure bill if also it is passed in tandem with Build Back Better. And the leadership of the Progressive Caucus just threw down that gauntlet and said, we need both to get one of them through, to get the Republican favored bill through. And both Biden and the Progressive Caucus caved. And rather than stick to that, they allowed only the infrastructure bill to get through. And Build Back Better was killed, never to be revived. And the upshot of that was that voters didn't really see much of a change in their economic status or well being during the Biden administration, which had terrible results in terms of undercutting to a significant degree the Harris campaign, such as it was. So that's an example of how the Progressive Caucus just didn't hang in there, didn't really fight strongly against the right wing and for progressive principles. And not to digress too much, but this happened during the early part of the Obama administration as well, where there was at least going to be a fight, we were told, put up for the public option, as it was called, so that there would be a partway step towards Medicare for all. And there was a vow from some progressives in the Progressive Caucus to say, if we don't get at least a public option as part of the healthcare overhaul, we're not going to vote for the what became known as Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. Again, those progressives caved. And so we've seen this pattern again and again, where the Progressive Caucus and those in it in leadership positions really have not, pardon the expression, stuck to their guns. And so we haven't had a fight for working people, for low and middle income people coming from progressives. And as a result, the right wing has romped.
Hmm. Thanks, Norman. Richard Hill, you have a question or comment on the book for Norman.
Yeah, thank you. I wonder, Norman, if we could get some historical perspective. The Democratic Party, as you describe it now, is, hopelessly uh, linked or in the sway of corporate interests. And it's hard to remember that this is a party that emerged from FDR's Democratic Party, the New Deal, a party that pr supported and promoted progressive initiatives for decades. But now, it's descended into what I think is sort of is like the narcolepsy of neoliberalism. Why is it taken so long for Democrats to emerge from that slumber of neoliberalism and to reclaim the mantle of New Deal progressivism that Bernie Sanders and a handful of others have been eloquently advocating now for more than a decade?
Well, I hope that the Democratic Party is emerging from that slumber that you described. And there were pivotal times, and certainly the Bill Clinton 8 years were pivotal because Clinton just basically, I can't say sold the Democratic Party, but leased it on a long-term basis to corporate power. I mean, let's just take media, for instance. In 1996, the Telecommunications Reform Act was jammed through Congress. Bill Clinton, Al Gore, the Republican Speaker, Newt Gingrich, they all wanted to sort of open the floodgates to broadcast and print media conglomerates to conglomerate further and further. And so the landscape at the time was fairly restricted. You couldn't have a rich person like Rupert Murdoch owning so many newspapers and TV stations, other outlets, places like Sinclair that now own literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of TV stations, one right-wing corporation, then were fairly restricted. And so you can see that in one realm after another where corporate power has prevailed. And it's been a battle between grassroots, between progressives, those who, as you allude to, want to carry forward the lantern that was such a powerful beacon of support for a humanistic society, the New Deal, rather than throw it into its grave and stomp on it, which is what corporate power has done. And so this battle has been raging. It happened in the Jesse Jackson campaigns of 1984 and 1988. That campaign was subdued first by Walter Mondale, then in 88 by Michael Dukakis. These were neoliberal, and in the case of Dukakis, technocrats who said it's not really about values so much as he said, competence. And we can carry through the Clinton era and to a large extent the Obama era. One of the things that I mentioned in the book is that during the first years of the Obama administration, he presided over the redistribution of wealth upward that was unprecedented in magnitude for a full century. I mean, this was the supposedly, at least somewhat progressive president. And so when I looked at bringing out this book, a couple of things I want to say about it. The Blue Road to Trump Hell is a title that alludes to the way in which, as the subtitle says, the Democratic Party paved the way for the autocracy that now exists in the United States, the semi-dictatorship becoming less and less semi from the Trump Oval Office. And we now have something that is horrific. We're pushing back against a fairly dictatorial regime running roughshod over the courts. And that is happening after the developments that aren't just or weren't just visible in hindsight, but was happening in real time. I mean, I have spoken throughout the last decade with Scott on Between the Lines about this battle between the neoliberals in the party and those who actually want to put up a fight against corporate power and fight for wannabe working people. And so it's not like, oh yeah, we're just looking in hindsight. And this is really a lot of the cornerstone of what I built through this book, because the book overwhelmingly is what was written in real time. I didn't sit this year in 2025 and say, oh, now it's apparent that the cave-in to the corporate forces in the Democratic Party paved the way to the first and second Trump administrations. The book is basically a collection of writing in real time, beginning in 2016, and it was not a mystery. And many progressives were saying in real time in 2016 and onward that no, you can't fight a Trump with the politics of a Hillary Clinton. You can't fight a Trump with the politics of Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. And that's the way it's turned out.
Yeah. Norman, you point out in your new book, excuse me, you point out in your new book that year after year, the Democratic Party has failed to address the nation's growing economic inequality crisis. And it's really come to a head now, I think, in ways I didn't expect. But instead of advocating and winning substantive, transformative new policies and programs that will improve, as you said a moment ago, the lives of working Americans, the party instead pushes for slow, incremental half measures that really haven't addressed the crisis of what we now call affordability. Trump largely won, as you said, both in 2016 and 24, because many voters took Trump at his word that he'd disrupt or burn down, the American broken economic system status quo. And, they hoped he would deliver economic change. Clearly, that hasn't happened. And instead, Trump, as we know, he works every day on behalf of his billionaire and millionaire friends, winning them huge tax breaks. And of course, with this budget bill that just went through in July, it was, from what I understand, the biggest transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich in the nation's history. And I guess that brings me to this question. What's a short list of policies and programs you feel the Democratic Party could and should champion that would clearly send a signal to the majority of Americans that the party's on their side? And with that, of course, you would hope they would win some elections.
There's a really long list that's available, and it polls really well, often even among Republicans. For instance, enhanced Medicare for all. that we would have a system finally of healthcare in this country that not only rhetorically but in practice presents healthcare as a complete human right. And so enhanced Medicare for all would be a very popular program. It is popular. As I say, it polls really well. Free public college. Again, we have free public K through 12, and the public supports through polling free public college. That's another position as well. Subsidized childcare by the government, subsidized public transportation. Now, this is going to start to sound familiar because Zoran Mandani won as mayor of New York just in the last few weeks on that kind of set of programs. And this is not, so to speak, rocket science. It's not difficult political science. It's actually, in a positive way, listening to people in a lowercase democratic way and listening to what people are saying, what the majority really wants. So the polls are reflecting that. And it's remarkable that we have, while the right wing is in power and completely contemptuously ignoring what most people in this country want and need, the so-called leadership of the Democratic Party in the House and the Senate, Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer, they're just going on their merry way, as though this sentiment didn't exist among not only most Democrats, but most people in the country.
Thanks, Norman. Melinda, I think you are on mute.
I have a follow-up to that. When the Green New Deal was introduced, and it wasn't tied to the Democratic Party or democratic socialism, it polled very well, like you were just saying, across party lines. But then as soon as it got attached to one party, then the other party and all their followers all of a sudden hated it, even though they supported the actual elements within it. So, I mean, how do you, if in fact it would be pursued in our incredibly divided country and divided Congress, even more so than the country, I think. How do you go about getting those progressive elements passed that people do support when, if it's tied to, one party or the other? I mean, both probably goes both ways, right? The other party would oppose it, and they would come out and, it reminds me of the guy back in when the Tea Party came in, who said, they were against Obamacare, and they said, "Don't touch my Social Security." They were very confused about where their Social Security came from.
Well, yeah, there was also the classic comment from a Republican booster at a town hall meeting, keep the government's hands off my Medicare, without even acknowledging Medicare as a government program. I think the fact is that you can't have a party fighting for people's interests if they don't fight for people's interests. And the Green New Deal is a great example. People may remember that soon after Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was first elected to Congress, she joined a sit-in at Nancy Pelosi's office, the Democratic leader in the House, for a Green New Deal. And shortly after that, as I outline and quote in the book, we had Nancy Pelosi publicly in an interview with Politico making fun of it. She called it a Green New Dream or whatever it's called. And so she disparaged, especially what young people who were supporting at that time the Democratic Party have been passionate about, their future, the future of their next generations, to deal with this climate emergency. When party leaders don't fight for a program like the Green New Deal, then it's going to collapse. It's a question of media presentation. It's a matter of leadership. And in this case, when you had Nancy Pelosi making fun of and disparaging the Green New Deal, then that helped to collapse the momentum, not at the grassroots, but on Capitol Hill and in the electoral process, it's been a challenge for progressives to keep the message afloat in a major way in the high profile media outlets. And what's needed is really a capacity to meld the infrastructure that exists, and this program is part of it, nationally among progressive websites, radio, television, film, drama, writings, all these different ways that progressives have built a pretty powerful set of de facto networks around the country where literally tens of millions of Americans, one way or another, are getting progressive analysis and information and news coverage every single day. That needs more of a melding with the organizing process, grassroots, electoral, and non electoral, that can kick in, especially during election campaign time. And this is a sort of a way to connect the growing understanding and information and analytical flow on the one hand with the fight for power. And I mean power in the government. So this is a challenge ahead.
Thank you. Richard, do you have a question or comment for Norman?
Yeah, I wanted to maybe shift the focus a tiny bit and talk about what I think is sort of a bifurcation of sometimes progressive or liberal uh, politicians on the issue of, between domestic policy and foreign policy. A liberal or progressive Democrat can sometimes, who has good policy, good domestic policy, progressive proposals, some of the ones that you mentioned in answer to Scott's question before, can have really abysmal foreign policy. Do you see any connection between progressive domestic economic policy and anti-imperialist, anti-neocon foreign policy in terms of a way to revitalize the Democratic Party's appeal to working class Americans?
In the real world, there are huge numbers of connections between domestic and foreign policy. Martin Luther King Jr. during the Vietnam War said that you can talk all you want about guns and butter, but actually, with all the money being spent on the military, you don't even get good oleomargarine. And we're seeing that decade after decade, where the military spending has so many terrible consequences. No radical, Dwight Eisenhower said that every bomb and every bullet was a theft from the children of the world. And that's as true now as it was back many decades ago. The connections are very difficult to unravel and parse and challenge the denial of when you get to the two parties, because I think more than ever, the differences between the Democratic and Republican parties on domestic concerns are huge. And this isn't to say that the Democratic Party is getting nearly as progressive as it should be on domestic policy, far from it. But anybody who is willing to look at the reality sees that the two major parties are hugely different when it comes to domestic policies. When it comes to foreign policies, much less so. And that is where we are right now more than ever. And what you're referring to, I think, has its echo in the past during the Vietnam War, those we used to call Cold War liberals, Scoop Jackson in the Senate, Edith Green in the House. These were people who were fighting for the Great Society legislation, and they were terrible war hawks, and they wanted to keep escalating the Vietnam War. And we're seeing that today, for instance, on the terrible developments in recent years in Gaza. The genocide that the U.S. has armed by Israel in Gaza against Palestinian civilians, that is a issue, and that's not the greatest word for such a life and death matter. It's a crucial matter of what do people stand for? in the Democratic Party.
Norman, I wanted to go to money issues here in U.S. politics. Democratic Party fundraising has for many years been dependent on big corporate donors. It's, a central theme of your book. And the deep pocket millionaires and billionaires, call the shots very often in the party, much like they do in the Republican Party. And I'm wondering, from your perspective and what you've traced in terms of the history of our politics in the last 20 so years, have candidates like Bernie Sanders, AOC Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and more recently Zoran Mamdani, have they shown the party how it could break away from big money interests and still raise the funds that they need to run effective campaigns, and then have the freedom to fight hard for policies that change the lives of their constituents for the better?
This is a huge change that the progressives who you mentioned can raise money without depending on big checks. The average donation for Bernie Sanders was $27. And so that's a threat. It's a threat to the big donors and to corporate power.
And Melinda, do you have a question for Norman?
Well, it's kind of a big question about your conclusions. When you talked about the big tent, and earlier when you spoke with us, you said, we'd have to challenge some of the people that are going to be in it, because we won't agree on everything. But your whole book is basically, critiquing the terrible role that corporate Democrats have played. And so, what role, like, do those even the specific people you've criticized, national Democratic leaders like the Clintons, both Clintons and Obama and Biden, Harris, I suppose, are they part of it? Or are they the ones that you need to keep out, even while you might let in other people that you wouldn't agree with on a lot of issues? Like, how do you decide?
Mm, yeah, well, when you need a united front against a fascistic Republican Party, you're going to need the Harrises and the Clintons. When you are fighting for an end to what Dr. King called the madness of militarism, when you need to fight corporate power, then you're going to need to fight those allies in the united front against the fascists. And I think this is one of the great and challenging difficulties that are right in front of us. That, and I think of, and I quoted in the book, Fred Hampton, the great young Black Panther leader who was killed, murdered in collusion between the Chicago police and the FBI of many decades ago. And he said, first we have to stop fascism because fascism is going to stop us all if we don't. And I think that's the situation we're in now. And at the same time, the contradiction is that if we simply go along with the corporatists and the militarists, then it hampers, if not destroys, our capacity to defeat the fascists. So on the one hand, we need to fight corporatism and militarism. And on the other hand, we need to ally with corporatists and militarists who are anti-fascist to overcome this terrible Trump regime.
Yeah, it's just interesting to think about how that would all happen going forward. And I think it's complicated. I think it's hard to know.
Definitely. It is very complicated. And one of the responses, which is understandable, and we heard a lot of it during the Biden administration, especially with the horrific support of genocide coming from the Biden-Harris administration and Harris's refusal during her 170-day campaign in 2024 to separate herself from basically the pro-genocide policy of the Biden administration vis-a-vis sending billions of dollars of weapons to Israel, we saw and heard that some people on the left said, well, I don't care who wins. I mean, in retrospect, and I think certainly many of us were saying so at the time, that was a completely wrong attitude. The idea that, oh, you go off and vote for Jill Stein in a swing state because we find the Democrats abhorrent in so many ways, that's a suicidal approach. As we might say, when you have a choice of evils and one evil is worse than the other, then one evil is worse than the other. And so it's very much a mistaken belief that in this electoral system we have in the United States, it's productive to go off and have a third party in partisan elections. And one way to say it is that progressives should support third parties on the right, because the more that we have third parties on the right, it will dilute and splinter off support that many Republicans now have. If we can splinter them, so much the better. Let's hope that there is a break off of some disaffected MAGA people who will start another party and get another right-wing party on the ballot and siphon off a couple percent votes. That would be great for 2028. I hope that we've learned the profound lesson, one of the profound lessons from 2024, that when push comes to shove and you get to a general election, you defeat the Republicans. And the way to do that is, if necessary, hold your nose, but you need to support the Democrat.
Maybe Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to start that new party in her time.
Let's hope. That would be great.
Yeah.
Richard, you have something for Norman.
Well, continuing on that track of electoral strategies, what are your thoughts on groups like Justice Democrats, and a whole movement to primary establishment Democratic candidates in numerous districts around the country? Is this a good strategy, or is it risking the kind of disasters that we've seen with third-party candidates?
Progressive primary challenges are very healthy, and they've revitalized, to the extent that's happened, the Democratic Party. If it wasn't for primary challenges of incumbent Democrats, we wouldn't have Presley now from Massachusetts in the House. We wouldn't have Ro Khanna. We wouldn't have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We wouldn't have gotten Cori Bush or Jamal Bowman. These are leaders who have pointed the way towards a genuine grassroots-fueled Democratic Party. And of course, the Democrats who are running the minority now in the House and Senate, they don't like primary challenges because it threatens their power.
Norman, in addition to the Democratic Party adopting a more aggressive pro-working class program, it seems that the party must also have a plan in place or a blueprint of some kind to protect democratic institutions from future despots and would-be dictators like Trump, who, as we've seen, have really so easily destroyed most of what we thought were guardrails to protect the rule of law, due process, and basic democratic ideals, and of course, checks and balances against authoritarian abuse that are embodied in the Constitution. Is the Democratic Party, from what you've seen, are they gearing up to take up that challenge if they should win the House or maybe the Senate as well in the 26th midterm election? Although there's a lot of concern about Trump's plan to either cancel or manipulate the outcome of the midterm election. But should the Democrats be prepared and ready to fight for sweeping reforms and fundamental change, as was on some scale fought for after the Nixon era after the Nixon Watergate abuses of power and corruption back then in the 70s.
One of the takeaways from the horrific real life nightmare we're in now is that there are basic structural flaws in the US government, and dare I say it, the Constitution. I mean, we could begin with why does Wyoming have two senators, and why does New York or Connecticut have two senators? It's just ridiculous. It's completely anti democratic. We know why this happened. Back when the Constitution was formed to get lower population states to sign on to the Constitution. That doesn't change the fact it's wrong. Now we're stuck with it, apparently. There's also the Electoral College, which comes from that inequity. Again, anti democratic in selecting a president. We have the power of the presidency, the functional abrogation of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution that gives the Congress the power to go to war, to declare war, not the executive branch. You know, it was called the unitary executive theory during the second Bush's presidency. Now it's gotten even worse. When we look at the power of the executive branch in making war, for instance, these are structural problems. And in the case of war, I mean, part of it is that the Congress simply has rolled over and let the president run the war machine. So that's part of it. But there is, unfortunately, I think, a deeper structural set of problems. Let's look at the courts. I mean, we know that the Supreme Court now is packed 6-3 with right wingers, giving, with few exceptions, what President Trump wants to him, whatever he asks for. At the same time, ultimately, and there's been some buzz about this, what about the question of if the president got a Supreme Court decision that he didn't like and he just ignored it and told the Secretary of Defense to order X, Y, and Z to happen? So it raises a fundamental question. I don't know the answer to this one. How many troops does the Supreme Court have? 0. How many troops does the Congress have? 0. This is a structural flaw, to put it mildly, and it's a deeper question that I don't know the answer to. But the first start is to roll back Republican power, and that means ousting Republicans from the House, the Senate, and then from the Oval Office.
Thanks, Norman. Melinda or Richard, as we wind down, you have maybe a final question for Norman about the book?
I don't have a final question, but I just thought it was interesting that what you wrote about. Now I can't remember her name. The woman you said was the mega star. She's a professor, I think, at Boston College, that a lot of people on the left read religiously. And her name is
Heather Cox Richardson.
right.
Yeah.
I've been reading her some. I like her historical perspective, but I don't consider her particularly progressive. But I didn't know that she so heartily defended Biden's debate performance. In June of 2024. That was totally shocking to me. But anyway, it was sort of an example, I guess, of how the Democratic establishment was still, rallying around him. And I just thought that was interesting.
Oh,
but
yeah,
I
it
want to
was
thank
stunning.
you for your book. I want to
Oh,
thank you
sure.
for your book. I think it's a really good, it's a fast read, and it's got a lot of really important things in it that I think would be good for a wide audience to read about. So
Well,
thank you.
thank you. And on that note, you're giving me a chance to mention I've written more than a dozen books, and this is the first time that the book is being released for free from the very start. And it's something I'm very excited about because while, of course, publishers need to make money and survive financially, and I've written books published by small, medium, and huge publishers at various times, this is a chance that I wanted to seize to say that from the very beginning, if people want to read the book as an ebook, whether some sort of EPUB format online or a PDF, they can do that from the very beginning and along the way see these wonderful cartoons by Matt Worker tracing the political evolution, devolution of the country in the last dozen years. And so people can do that simply by going to the web. It's blueroad.info. That's blueroad.info. And at the very top of the homepage, it just says, click here, read the free book. And so, of course, it's coming out in print in December and will be available online in that way. But I think of the saying from Julian Assange or whoever, information wants to be free. And if people are watching or listening to our conversation, they're not having to pay for it. And I think that's very important because there's a class aspect to information flow. And we're seeing that more and more with paywalls on websites. We're seeing it from Substacks. And it's saying to people, if you want the information, you've got to pay money for it. And if you don't have much money, you're able to buy less information. It's not a nostalgia to mention that way back, you didn't pay for television. Now, the bad part was it was only 3 or 4 channels that you could watch, 3 or 4 national networks. But the idea that you would have to pay for watching TV would have been anathema. Now we're used to it. Everything is being, or most things are being monetized. And so, anyway, I do want to invite people, go to blueroad.info. Want to invite you to look at these marvelous cartoons by Pulitzer Prize winner Matt Worker. And step by step, in real time, the book shows how I wrote about what was happening, this catastrophe that has come upon the United States in the form of the Trump regime.
Thanks, Norman. Richard, did you have any final question or closing comments you'd like to make?
Yeah, I guess I did have a question. I'm really fascinated by this development, the victory of Mamdani in New York City, that sent like shockwaves not just through the Northeast, but through the entire country, apparently. And the Democratic establishment is trying to figure it out. The Republican establishment is quaking in its boots. But I wonder what you think of this strange summit that occurred between Trump and Mamdani. And, maybe if you could discuss the pluses and minuses of this for progressives and what you think the respective strategies of Mamdani and Trump were for this bizarre meeting.
Well, Zoran Mandani is a tremendously important leader. He's another generation of the politics of Bernie Sanders. He is putting forward the kind of programs that could revitalize politics in the United States, adapted to the 21st century, to this era, moving into the second quarter of the 21st century. It's the New Deal made modern and being updated and vigorously presented in such a clear way that, as we've seen, the voters really have rallied behind it in New York City, a city that's had really crummy mayors for quite a while. And I do want to mention that when Zoran Mandani was clearly about to enter the race for mayor, the organization where I work, Roots Action, announced our support for him. And it wasn't because he was personable, although he was. It wasn't because he had occupied elective office in the state legislature, which he had at that point. It was because he was able to articulate a progressive politics, and he clearly was going to rely on grassroots organizing to have his campaign move forward. And when he did announce after that support that we mentioned nationwide to our members, he was polling 1%. And yet Zoran Mandani believed in and was able to mobilize grassroots volunteer power, 40,000, ultimately 100,000 volunteers going door to door into supermarkets and all the rest of it. So that's, I think, a foreground for what has occurred. And his tremendous popularity and the resonance of his messaging obviously made President Trump feel that it was in his interest to seem friendly towards Mamdani. And the bizarre, astonishing meeting between the two and their press availability and de facto news conference really was not only dramatic and entertaining, but also maybe a watershed. I would say that we don't know the long-term implications. There has been some conjecture on the left that this meeting and the warm words from Trump will open the door to socialism as a concept, as a program, as an ideology to become more palatable, become more welcomed by a wide political spectrum in the United States. That might be, but there is a hazard that the show that Trump put on could be beneficial to softening his image. He is a fascist. He is trying to be a dictator. And it would be a mistake for anyone to believe that the show that he put on with Mamdani in the Oval Office in any way mitigates the necessity of fighting against every aspect of Trumpism. So it's a contradiction involved. I think Mamdani has very clearly handled this superbly. And the most publicized moments of his visit to the Oval Office was when a reporter asked, well, Mayor-elect, you have said that President Trump is a fascist. Do you still say that? And Trump broke in and said, don't answer. Just say yes. It's simpler that way. And this was sort of a punchline in the media. And what was not so clear is that during those moments, Zoran Mamdani answered yes.
Right.
And he reiterated when he went on Meet the Press the next weekend, a couple of days later, that he stood by everything he has said about Trump, that he's a despot, that he's a fascist. So Mamdani has not caved in any way. And it's unclear who will end up having benefited from that meeting.
Wow.
Yeah.
Friends, I have to sign off, but this has been a very enjoyable conversation and hope a lot of people read the book.
Well, Melinda, thanks so much for your participation, and likewise, Richard, and of course, Scott. It's been very good for me. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I did have just one other question. If you have to go, Melinda,
Yeah,
we'll
okay.
we'll get you later. But
Hi.
are you optimistic that we'll see change of leadership within the Democratic Party? I mean, that's of course the major theme of the book is fighting for change within the Democratic Party. As you've seen, the most recent elections, you've had moderates and progressives win in the off-year elections. But do you see pressure coming to a crescendo within the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, for substantive change?
I'm going to quote the great Antonio Gramsci, who didn't originate this, I found out, but has popularized it. Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. I'm not hopeful, but I think it's possible. People are going to have to put up a fight. As we speak, there's a DNC, Democratic National Committee meeting coming up in Los Angeles mid-December 2025. And the leadership is better than it was under Biden, but that's a low bar.
Hmm.
And the DNC traditionally and to the present day is made up of about 450 people who do whatever the chair tells them. And it's not a very optimistic scenario because the chair, Ken Martin, while again better than Jamie Harrison, who was handpicked and run by President Biden, Ken Martin calls himself a progressive, but he's really not challenging the underpinnings of corporate power and militarism of the Democratic Party. And when you go along to get along, you're going along and getting along with a party that is neoliberal, that is militaristic, and doesn't have a strong advocacy that will appeal to working class voters to counter this terrible Republican regime.
Well, Norman, we want to thank you for your time and congratulations on this new book. And just once again, it's free, kind of unprecedented for most publishers, but give that information out one more time for our listeners so they can get a copy before we say goodbye to them.
Yeah, thanks, Scott, and thanks to the whole crew of Between the Lines. The book is just coming out now. It is actually already online. It is called The Blue Road to Trump Hell, and anybody is invited to read it for free. You simply go to blueroad.info. That's blueroad.info. And I'd love to hear from people as to what they think.
Right. Well, we've been speaking with Norman Solomon, the National Director of the progressive activist group RootsAction.org, as well as Executive Director of the Institute for Public Accuracy. And Norman, as we've been talking about, is the author of the brand new book published the first week of December, I believe, The Blue Road to Trump Hell, How Corporate Democrats Paved the Way for Autocracy. Thanks for all you do, Norman, and thanks for sharing your time with us this morning.
Thanks a lot, Scott.